Okay, son, bring your family. Grandma's back from vacation with a whole bunch of photos to show you. And this time, I have an entire book of adventures to show you. Here we go. It all starts with this rainbow we saw on our first hike in the meadow. Oh, it was so pretty. Granddaughter, on our second hike, we saw a bunch of bridges over these beautiful rivers. It was so peaceful. Where is everyone? You've just got to see these amazing windmills we saw on our third hike. They were magnificent. Okay, you can't miss this one. On our last hike, we found this fascinating cave. We even saw some bats. Guys, where'd you all go?
Hey there everyone, I am Jeff. This is Tabletop Toolbox, and today I'm looking forward to telling you about Meadow's Adventure Book expansion, published by Rebel Studio and designed by Klemens Kalicki, who also designed the base game and the downstream expansion. Now, right off the bat here, I'm in a little bit of an awkward position because I've already done a lengthy review of Meadow and the downstream expansion, but over on the Dice Tower channel and just over 2 years ago. So while this is a bit unorthodox, I'm going to point you to that review if you don't know anything about Meadow and would like to get up to speed. All I'm going to share here is that Meadow is a predominantly card-based tableau building game where players will take turns choosing cards from this main board before placing those cards into a tableau in front of them, representing a meadow teeming with flora and fauna. Mechanically, you're playing these cards to gain their value in points, but thematically, these cards represent something of an ecosystem, as cards will require symbols provided by other cards, covering those cards in a way that seems to imply that the covered card is now supporting the ecology of the new card. There are, of course, some other rules and actions here and there, but I'll let my prior self tell you all about those in that other review if you're so inclined. Before I move on, however, I do want to recap what is perhaps my favorite thematic element of Meadow, the campfire board, where players can go to take a little breather, perching themselves on a tree trunk stool and sharing a little story about the diverse ecosystem in their meadow. Again, mechanically, you're just putting a marker out there to illustrate that you've earned some points, but I much prefer to imagine myself taking a seat and telling everyone around the fire about that unique butterfly I found, and my favorite field cat. This has always been my favorite part of Meadow, literally showing people the cards in my tableau that provide those symbols. And I've done this game after game, working laboriously for the 9 points that this board can provide, oblivious to how many other points I was possibly stepping over in the process. So it was a slight bit disappointing to learn that this board is left in the box when using the Adventure Book expansion and is instead replaced by this, well, Adventure Book. Within the thick, beautifully illustrated pages of this book are 6 different modules with which to alter the base game experience. Each of these modes of play essentially represents a different hike that players will take. And here's the thing, I want to cover each of these different experiences, but in the spirit of Meadow, I don't want to just cover the rules. I want to tell you about how these evolve the theme of Meadow. Also keep in mind that this is essentially 6 games in one, so there's a lot to cover here. In Chapter 1, we're going to experience the elements, namely the sun and the rain, and we're going to do that using the landscape cards from the base game. These cards actually conveyed the idea of a hike, or at least an adventure within the original game, but now we'll be able to add an observation of the weather from these adventures. Cards taken from specific rows or columns on the main board, demarked by these sun and rain markers, will move players down the sun and rain tracks in the Adventure Book. And when resetting those tracks, players can take a weather card. These tuck behind those landscape cards with or without their discovery cards, and they simply provide extra points, but often provide a bonus action, like drawing or placing extra cards. This mode of play offers minimal variation to the base game. It does still provide pairs of symbols for players to score points for having in their meadow, and players can't get shut out from these scoring opportunities like in the base game. There's also a new 5-point token, increasing your point potential on this board to 14, but there's less story here. You just place a score marker on the row of the symbols you have. So this hike is pretty straightforward, and as I said, it doesn't really change the feel or complexity or strategy of the original game. That isn't quite the case, however, with the second hike in this book, where the bridges you encounter along your way is now the prevalent theme. For the first time, your personal meadow is now bifurcated by this bridge tile, onto which 4 random tiles will be placed, challenging each player to have these icons on either side of this bridge. If at any point you have both symbols of a single tile on the appropriate sides of that bridge, you flip the tile over to score the relevant points. But that's not all. The adventure book itself also depicts pairs of bridges, with 3 symbols depicted amongst each set. To score these goals, players must arrange the left and center, or the center and right symbol shown on each bridge pair on either side of the personal bridge token in their meadow. Between the bridge token in your meadow and the trio in the adventure book, there are now 28 points up for grabs, but the effort you'll have to exert to get those symbols into place is a substantial challenge, since each symbol isn't equally distributed into the 4 decks of cards in the game. And after the south deck of cards is removed from the game at the midway point, getting some of the early and mid-game symbols present in your meadow becomes nearly impossible. The cost here, of course, is a bit of Meadow's already thin theme. I have to see a flower and a bird, but they have to be on the precise ends of a bridge? Why? But I digress. Let's take a trip to Holland's iconic Tulip Valley, the setting for the third hike of Adventure Book. I was quite thrilled to see this theme just a few weeks after procuring my copy of Windmill Valley by Board & Dice, which shares the same setting. The Bloemen route in Holland is a beautiful 25-mile route through gorgeous fields of colorful tulips, studded by wooden windmills, which actually serve to move water out of these low-lying fields. In this hike, the Bloemen route will be represented by these tiles beneath each player's tableau. This expansion comes with a hiker meeple that you'll place on the left side of this path of tiles, and you'll move that hiker to the right each time you play a card above a tile that has a matching symbol on that tile. But the hiker can only move to the right, so you'll be required to build your meadow left to right, and each time you move your hiker, you'll rotate the windmill of your player color in the adventure book clockwise, so that the number of your movements is visible in the space within the wheel. When your hiker moves to a new tile in your path, you'll get to flip one of the blades to your windmill, providing a one-time bonus action. I'd be doing a lousy job as a reviewer if I failed to mention that these windmills spin perfectly on the pages of this book, thanks to small magnets hidden beautifully within the pages of the book and the hub of your windmill. Listen, quality has never been an issue with any release of Meadow. Anyways, similar to the previous hike, this one further complicates the building of your own tableau, and it's not with the left to right construction of your meadow as I thought it would be. It's the requirement to place symbols in specific columns of your meadow at the right time. It's not enough to have a tree in your meadow, or even on the left or right side of your meadow. It now has to be specifically in the 5th or 6th column of your meadow, as an example. And a tree isn't too hard to get placed, but when it's something like a fence or some berries, symbols that are already slightly rare in the distribution of these decks, it can become a significant challenge. One that you can skip, mind you, as your hiker can jump as far along this path as you'd like him to. But the first 8 movements will only score you 1 point each. Getting the next 6 movements, worth a total of 14 more points, is a significant challenge that, again, distracts you from building a high-scoring meadow to instead collect points from the adventure book itself. And again, it's like this game is forcing you to have a specific hike. This path says you must see a flower, and only then can you see a butterfly. But okay, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because I first must rise above myself with hike number 4 in a fleet of hot air balloons. And what an elevated adventure this will be. Now here, the Meadow reverts back to its original rules with no new pieces or requirements for the placement of cards in your tableau. However, much like a hot air balloon itself, the winds will affect what you can see, or what you're trying to see in your individual Meadow. This compass in the adventure book, again held in place with magnets, will determine 6 pairs of symbols players must try to place in their Meadow. 3 of those symbols are placed during setup, while the other 4 will appear through the compass and will change as the direction of the wind changes throughout the game. Each player will have 6 hot air balloon tokens in front of them, and when they match a pair of symbols on the compass, they flip the corresponding balloon over, permanently scoring the points shown even if the symbols of that balloon later change. Up to this point, I haven't really talked about how players interact with this adventure book. These puzzle piece tokens are installed into the back cover of the booklet, depending on player count. On your turn, just as with the original Fire Pit board, you can use the adventure book by placing the back end of one of your path tokens into the adventure book, triggering the action on your path token as normal, but also being able to score various goals of your hike, such as with these balloons and with the weather and bridge modules. In this particular hike, however, slotting your token has an extra unique effect. These small numbers shown in the compass allow players to climb these streamers printed on the adventure book. At the end of each round, the highest player piece on either of these streamers will indicate the direction that the compass turns. Now there's a bunch of rules here about how players climb these streamers and also how they can move from one to the other, as well as bonus actions and even points they can get as they climb these streamers, but I'm going to go ahead and gloss over those for now, just as I'm going to gloss over the inexplicable thematic tide climbing the mooring of a bunch of balloons to change the way the wind blows. Instead, I'll just explain that the changing goals from round to round emphasizes the precise timing required to get a combo in place and score it within a finite number of turns, all in the interest of snagging 18 points. Of course, you might be able to predict what goals could be required in the next round, which is tricky since it's technically the last player to visit the adventure book in a round that would have the final say on how the compass will turn at the end of the round. If all this hiking isn't quite your speed, how do you feel about climbing some stairs? Hike number 5 is the observation tower, and I feel that this is the most diverse of modules within this expansion. The trigger to a lot of the optional actions and goals in this hike is the height of the columns in your Meadow. As these columns of cards start to stack up, you'll place a token beneath them. That token gives you access to the observation tower in the adventure book, placing your hiker on the floor of the tower corresponding to the number of cards in the column you chose for that round. Each floor provides a variety of bonus actions, and players can claim scoring tokens or take special actions on the floor of and any floor beneath their hiker when they trigger a binocular action. These actions are granted by these specialty path tokens, which players will get to use starting in the second round of the game. These tokens may let players draw 1 or more cards from the main board, play 1 or more cards into the Meadow, or take some road tokens, or, and we think it's an or, they can notch these tokens into the adventure book to take 2 binocular actions. These actions depend on which level of the observation tower your hiker is standing on, and these again can allow players to draw or play cards, score pairs of symbols in their Meadow as with the other modules, or even take these unique scoring tokens, which reward players if the depicted symbol or symbols are present in their Meadow at the end of the game. As I read the rules to this module, I thought it was going to be pretty fun, but I'll admit that it wasn't quite what I expected. I thought that the diverse spread of actions available on the observation tower would give players a lot more to work with, but what I didn't expect was the challenge presented by trying to hit certain heights of cards in our Meadow. It's not too often that you're going to stack cards more than 3 or 4 high in your Meadow because of how these symbols consume each other. Base symbols are usually bugs, bugs lead to plants, plants sometimes lead to small animals pave the way for big animals, and nothing requires those symbols to stack above. So you find yourself in this weird position where you're trying to find ways to cover cards merely for the purpose of reaching a certain height, just so you can try and grab a scoring tile from the observation tower, and again, you find yourself ignoring the point or points in your Meadow just to grab a few points from this adventure book. Even more disappointing in particular are the rules clearly omitted from this hike. We aren't sure if these tokens are meant to be dual-ended like the base tokens are, and despite there being a supply of scoring tiles placed to the side of the adventure book during setup, we're never instructed as to when these tiles are replaced on the tower. I expected to have a lot of tough decisions with all the stuff provided in this module, but since you can only use these specialty tokens 5 times throughout the entire game, I realized that this module was actually slightly less than what meets the eye. In addition, timing becomes more of a hassle than I really expected, since you'll want to coincide your ability to reach the higher elevations of the tower with your ability to make the most use of these actions, since you cannot reuse a column of cards from your Meadow more than once, and you're not likely to have very many columns in your Meadow with 6 or more cards in them. In the long run, this module just left me wanting more. Finally, it's time to visit the origin story of the Batman. Okay, that's a stretch, I'll confess, but the 6th and final hike here takes us deep into a cave, and along the way, players will admire and somehow collect prehistoric paintings from the cavern walls. Of course, in the usual nature of Meadow, players can only claim these paintings if they have certain pairs of symbols visible in their Meadow. And also somewhat odd is the fact that these paintings don't provide any points, but simply let you move further into the cave, granting extra actions, extra cards, extra points, etc. Now, interestingly enough, this is the first module that alters the board of cards that players are drafting from by adding 8 cards into each deck during setup. Players can gain extra points based on how many of these cards they've managed to acquire and place into their Meadow by the end of the game. But the interesting thing here is the setup, which instructs you to distribute those 8 cards into the top half of each of these decks. And I think this is probably the right time to go ahead and shift this video into review mode. I have always loved Meadow from my very first play in 2021. Besides being one of the most beautiful games in my collection, it is arguably simplistic in its gameplay, but allows for plenty of meaningful decisions as you strive to place as many cards as you can, score as many symbol bonuses as you can, and play as efficiently as possible. Arguably the best move each turn is to simply place a scoring card from the board into your Meadow, but that won't always be an option, so then it becomes how many points can you score with the fewest necessary moves. These modules, however, seem to change the focus and the mood of the original game. If I didn't know any better, and I'm not suggesting that I do, it's almost as if Klemens started to feel bored with his original casual, simplistic design and simply sought to make something hard. These modules increase the randomness and they start to demand more from the players than this theme would even remotely imply. The weather and observation tower modules are only slight alterations to the original game, but the bridges, windmills, and balloon modules push this game into a level of frustration that honestly doesn't feel appropriate to the heart of the original title. In those modules, I found myself in this difficult game of Go Fish, desperately trying to find specific symbols, desperately trying to keep spaces available to place those cards in, and all while racing against time, as the base game allows very few options to go card hunting in the first place. And on top of all that, I was trying to precisely time each of my card plays, feeling more like an air traffic controller than someone out to enjoy a beautiful Meadow. And I started to feel like Klemens himself recognized this when he told us to distribute those cave module cards into the top half of each of these decks. It's almost like he's admitting here that, yeah, I've made this pretty difficult, haven't I? Here, I'll make these cards a little easier to find. And some of these modules even exacerbate the abstract nature of Meadow. Okay, listen, the theme here has always been art deep, but like a nutrient-rich topsoil can always be found if someone was willing to dig just a bit beneath the surface. That realization of the ecosystem, that desire to share a story of your Meadow, it's here. It's ozone thin, but it's here. But these modules pull players further from those discoveries. Here it is more about just chasing points. It's more about looking for a card with a specific symbol and less about the art on the remaining 90% of that card. And the more and more that I played through these modules, the more that I experienced these versions of Meadow, the more that I longed to return home. To a beautiful field, an adorable little critter, and my favorite field cat. Let me be clear, I love Meadow and I would recommend the base game to just about anyone, and I have enjoyed a few of these hikes, but I realized along the way that my favorite additions to Meadow have always simply been more cards, more nature, more bugs, and more bunnies. And I will say that you can simply dump most of these cards from these modules into their respective decks and play regular old Meadow. And I think that after I close this book at the end of this review, I might do just that, because honestly, they've turned Meadow into a game that I simply haven't enjoyed playing. In fact, I can't even say that they're worth playing, as I've scored consistently lower overall scores when I've scored the highest points possible from the adventure book itself. In those few games where a player struggled to meet the requirements of these modules and instead just aimed to play as many cards into their Meadow as they could, they've actually won those games. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that you can play these modules back to back, using something of a milestone system to award stars to players. And the player with the most stars at the end of the campaign is the overall winner. There are also solo rules for each of these modules, and I can report that they are as easy to approach and play as the original solo mode. So if a tougher, perhaps more stressful version of Meadow is what you're looking for, you can grab your copy from Asmodee, who is distributing Meadow Adventure Book to the US market. As for me, I might just stick to the base game, but I will happily tell you to go take a hike. Cheers.
On our second hike, we saw all these bunch of bridges. Okay, you can miss this one.
Can't miss this one. Oh, you can miss this one. Oh, okay, bye.
Are you done now?
No, probably.
Are you done now? Are you done now?